We've talked multiple times about how motorcycle design and style can emphasize either function or form. Look no further than the classic dirt bike or sport bike design. Sure, they can look cool, but these motorcycles have a purpose, and it's to be as fast as possible on their given terrain. Other times, however, motorcycles can heavily lean in the way of form. Think of bikes like Triumph's modern classics. It's not that a heavy metal gas tank or upright seating position or round headlight really makes the bike any better at a particular job. It just looks cool. Motorcycle apparel and gear and fashion are no different. From the very beginning, motorcyclists were building a unique style around their hobby, often because of certain needs, whether it's as simple as covering up your ankles for wind protection or minimizing damage from a crash. In this way, function often leads to form. A dirt bike looks cool because you're so used to it and you associate it with a certain style of riding, and even though it all looks that way primarily for function, it can still look cool. Motorcycle fashion is no different. Let's go all the way back over 100 years into the past to the turn of the century and start our journey through the history of motorcycle fashion and style. Early motorcycle gear was heavily inspired by another form of riding, which is horseback riding. See, many of the needs were the same for motorcyclists, and at the very beginning, motorcycles weren't much faster than horses. The primary form of clothing for motorcycling in the early 1900s was the tweed suit. Not only did it provide a level of protection against the elements, more importantly, it was the gentleman's outfit of choice for countryside activities, and at this time, that's what motorcycling was. It was an expensive hobby, often limited only to wealthy men, and if you look closely at pictures from this time, you'll see, one other common thread, and that's long boots and long gloves, though many riders still just chose to wear dress shoes. Police and military riders would wear long boots and gloves, and this sort of trickled down to the general public as they added a certain level of wind protection as well as protection for your legs and feet and hands in the event that you did go down. But even at this time, you do see old photos that break the norm. You see women in like high heels and dresses, or men in long sleeve shirts with no gloves or boots or anything. Guess it's sort of like the old-timey version of a squid, you could say. But again, if you were to characterize the fully geared up motorcyclists, it would be that tweed suit with long gloves and boots and probably a flat cap. As motorcycle racing became more popular from 1910 and on, gear and fashion started to evolve for the motorcyclists. One of the more interesting symbols taken by racers and riders alike was the skull. Since ancient times, the skull represented death and mortality and was often incorporated by groups with, shall we say, ill intent. Think of pirates, for example. But in motorcycling, it was taken on and adapted with a slightly different meaning, mainly the acceptance of one's own mortality as well as rebellion and toughness, a sort of ride or die way of living.
If you're going along at a steady 30, 40 mile an hour on an open road in a queue of traffic, you can bet he's the boy who's going to go flashing past with the throttle wide open. And you can bet he's the boy in 6 months who's going to be in a coffin.
But much like the goth movement of my own youth, standing out and identifying with other riders was really the main point. The kids who showed up to school with skulls all over their clothes, well, it really didn't have anything to do with harming others or yourself or intimidating people the way that pirates used them. It was just a way of standing out and being different and sort of trying to rebel. Racing and just more aggressive riding brought about the need for helmets in these early years, and early motorcycle helmets, again, often imprinted with a skull, were leather and really did little to save the rider from brain damage in the event of a crash. The emergence of the racing sweater came about in these early decades as well. These were close-fitting, thick wool sweaters, and the name of the rider's respective club or race team would be embroidered on the front. Again, protection was still not the main priority at this time. This was a piece of clothing that was warm and really helped for wind protection, but was really going to do very little to save you in the event of a crash. Now, the iconic leather jacket would begin to become a staple for motorcycle riders through the 20s, and the first purpose-built leather motorcycle jacket was designed in New York in 1928 by Irving Scott. These were heavy, thick, abrasive-resistant jackets. As we still know today, leather is a great option for abrasion protection if you go down or if you slide on your motorbike. Now, into the 1930s, we do see the emergence of the crash helmet with the infamous death of Lawrence of Arabia on his Bruff Superior. A study was initiated by Lawrence's doctor showing that indeed Lawrence's death was due to brain contusions, perhaps preventable by a sufficient helmet. World War II played a massive part in the emergence of crash helmets as well, as it was required by the British military that the riders wear these new protective helmets. Through the 30s and 40s, the general look of a typical rider had really changed drastically from the early 1900s. Riders no longer wore tweed suits with flat caps and long leather boots and gloves. Now the motorcyclist would likely be found wearing denim jeans over leather engineering boots, a leather jacket, and perhaps a scarf depending on where you were located, an open-faced helmet with aviator goggles. These were all options. But when you look at the pictures of riders from the 40s and 50s, it's safe to say that most average riders still didn't wear helmets, and many didn't wear goggles. This photo is a really good example. All of the riders in this picture are wearing those engineer boots with large cuffed jeans, like with big old cuffs. Some wore hats and some didn't, some wore goggles, but most of them aren't. Honestly, the only absolute really at this time were the jeans and the boots. This was pretty much what every rider wore. But again, the fully geared up rider of the 40s and 50s would be someone wearing the jeans, the engineering boots, leather gloves, and either a leather jacket or a wax cotton jacket, depending on where you were located, an open face helmet, and goggles, and maybe, again, a big white scarf, depending on what part of the world you resided. The overall style was adapted going into the 60s with the cafe racer ton-up scene, especially in the UK, but for the most part, this style really stayed consistent through the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But in America, style did become more segmented among motorcycle groups, and one of the standout movements was that of the American clubs in the 60s and on. The clubs were there prior to that, but the style really became a thing in the 60s. And even today, this overall style is the preferred choice for Harley riders who are a part of a club. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, the rise of motorcycle gangs, most notably the Hells Angels, led to this style. This was the epitome of motorcycle culture standing out in rebellion, and arguably the standout piece of fashion connected to these movements was the leather vest. Now, this was better suited for riding in warmer weather where a lot of these groups resided. Riders with leather vests could keep the overall aesthetic of the rebellious motorcycle rider while making themselves stand out from that crowd even a little bit more, hence the term one percenters. These are the most exclusive and perhaps most dangerous of the riders during that time, even though the average rider was often sort of associated with the one percenters. It was sort of assumed that every type of rider was a one percenter. And this was obviously not true. It was true, though, that Hells Angels at one time did require that you have a criminal past to even join. I'm not saying these groups weren't dangerous. They for sure were, and they were more dangerous in the past than they are today. But even today, there are still motorcycle gangs that are active that you don't really want to mess with. I wonder if they'd let me in with my careless driving ticket I got when I was 14 from taking my dad's Chevy S10 out and doing burnouts in the nearby cul-de-sac. It's pretty rebellious, if you ask me. As motorcycles themselves evolved, though, into the 70s and 80s and 90s, bikes became more varied, and so did overall style with that. While Harley riders kept a more old school look, we saw the emergence of what could be called the Power Ranger style for those riding more sporty machines. The Japanese motorcycle companies were making bikes for loads of different types of riders. There were cruisers and more standard bikes, as well as literal race machines for the road. The general attire of racers on the track sort of trickled down to the riders of these bikes. Think, the early GSXRs and Honda CBR riders of the 80s and 90s and on. And basically, whatever the GP riders wore, these riders began to wear the same, or at least to some extent, the same stuff that those riders wore. And that really leads us into the 2000s and up until today. In terms of motorcycle style, the current era is, in my humble opinion, the era of cosplay. If you don't know what cosplay is, it's essentially dressing up as something or someone else for fun. And like motorcyclists, sometimes cosplay gets a little too serious. Now, if you remove the riders who just wear gear for the sake of safety or just riding long miles, think about touring and adventure bike riders. Again, this would be more function over form, and it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with style. You end up with three basic riders. You've got the pirates, the Power Rangers, and the posers. Pirates are those who still dress like they're part of the Hells Angels, and they go from bar to bar riding loud, big, heavy, ugly Harleys, but they've never committed a crime in their life, and they've never actually been a part of a real motorcycle gang, and they've probably done no worse than I did when I did burnouts in my dad's Chevy S10. They look tough, and they might not wave to you if you're on a Honda Grom or really anything but a Harley, but trust me, they're as harmless as any other grandpa out there. Next, we have the Power Rangers, which we mentioned before. These are the guys who wear full racing gear, like full leathers, riding boots, the most expensive helmets and gloves, and enough armor to survive a 200 km/h crash, And they're sitting there stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic, sweating their asses off, not only because of their gear, but also because they're riding a 200 horsepower death machine that does nothing but pump out excess heat at idle. This is the Power Ranger. Now don't relax just yet, because I might be coming for you next. The last motorcyclist's style is the poser. This is the guy who buys retro motorcycle gear to match his retro motorcycle. This is the person who thinks that he was born in the wrong era, so he rides a liquid-cooled, traction-controlled, electric start wannabe 60s motorcycle with his open-faced Bell helmet and $600 wax cotton jacket, and also he has a beard. I'm sorry, the beard is essential. I guess I'll never be this person, because I can't really grow a beard. Now, the thing I don't like about current motorcycle style is it's primarily looking back or looking to something else, trying to emulate something that it isn't. The pirate isn't in a gang, the Power Ranger is not a MotoGP rider, and the poser is just a poser. But looking back has become part of our culture for the last 10 or 20 years. Like, this has been a huge part of Western culture. Most movies are remakes of something older and better, even things from the 90s. Like, even the 90s is becoming cool. I don't know what's with that, because I lived through the 90s and it was not cool. Maybe I'm being too critical. Maybe the constant imitation isn't a bad thing. Maybe it's no different than the influence of World War II military riders or police riders or riders in the 20s trying to look like the motorbike racers of their era. The great thing is, there's loads of options for you. You can even go as far as I did in a recent video and try out motorcycle gear from the past. Regardless of what you wear when you ride, I think we can all agree on one thing. Try to fit a helmet into your style. Lawrence of Arabia was cool, yes, and he probably didn't know any better, but he didn't have to die. And motorcycle fashion shouldn't get in the way of safety. No, that doesn't mean we all wear full tracksuits and armor-infused boots. Yeah, just wear a helmet.